Welcome to the Merryn Talks Money Market Wrap, where we talk about the biggest moves in markets this week and what's been driving them. I'm John Stepek, senior reporter at Bloomberg and author of the Money Distilled newsletter, and I'm filling in for Merryn this week because she's on holiday. So joining us this week is Simon French, a friend of the pod, and also the Managing Director, Chief Economist and Head of Research at Panmure Liberum, the UK's largest independent investment bank. Simon, welcome back. It's lovely to have you here.
John, it's great to be here. Thank you.
What do you think of the studio? We've gone properly up market. It's just especially for you.
Well, this is terrific, and thank you very much.
It's not bad.
Merryn's not here; she's on holiday, but she's missing out, isn't she, on this sort of august surroundings we've got ourselves?
She's going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
But so today I thought we would have a chat about. We'll start out talking about the UK energy cap because we just got the new cost of our bills coming in. Just a wee chat about what's going to happen with inflation and maybe how that's going to affect the consumer.
Yep.
And then I thought we should have a chat about gilt markets and the Labour leadership battle and Tony Blair's sort of interesting intervention in that. Today he's written a big long letter basically talking about what the Labour Party needs to do to get serious about winning elections and getting the country going. But let's start with the energy cap. So from July, household energy bills are going to be going up by a substantial amount.
Yep.
And I really just wanted to ask you about what you think that's going to do to inflation and the Bank of England and the UK consumer from here.
Yeah, so a bit of context here. The energy price cap for the second quarter of the year, about £1,640 for the average dual fuel household.
Yeah, this is important. When people talk about this, because
Yeah.
I think people often get confused, and they still get confused, but the energy price cap is for the average household.
Yes.
So the price is actually per unit of electricity and gas that you use. So if you're wanting to know what your bill's going to be, it's going to be that times the amount of energy you use. It's not a cap on, £1,800 is not the maximum regardless of how much energy you use. So I think that's important for people at home to realise.
I think that's important for people at home, and also the fact that this gets reviewed every quarter. It used to be done every 6 months, and therefore obviously the peak energy usage is coming into the winter period, and this is for probably the quarter where energy is least used by households. So it is not just this move, and we'll come on to talk about this, but it is movements potentially in Q4 and into Q1 next year that are probably more material for UK household spending and of course for inflation. And you ask what the transmission mechanism is here. Well, there's an arithmetic change from the fact that about 4% of the CPI basket is made up from household energy, and that going up by 13% quarter on quarter and about 20% on the year will mean at about 0.4, 0.5% headline CPI.
Yes, it's quite a big chunk.
Correct. Yeah. But to move to the transmission mechanism through to monetary policy is a known effect, and it's the type of thing which the Bank of England will be quite comfortable looking through as something relatively, I'm going to use the word, transitory. Yeah. What we worry about, what central banks worry about, certainly now and did worry about in their defence back in 2022, the last time we had an energy price shock, is those second order effects. Yeah. And when you're trying to understand how high inflation will go and whether monetary policy has to respond, it's whether those second order prices in manufacturing, in construction, in services feed off the initial impulse. So companies, do they have the pricing power to retain their margins? Yeah. Do workers have the negotiating power to raise their wages to maintain their value in real terms? Is demand strong enough to withstand all this? And I think that is where, when trying to get to the conclusion, why central banks, the Bank of England particularly, are unlikely to respond in anything like the same way as they did in 2022, because the demand conditions are much softer, particularly as the excess savings that a lot of households, not all households, but a lot of households have built up during the pandemic, that is no longer the backstop to their demand that was very prevalent at the start of 2022.
I said basically we would need a stronger economy to generate second order inflation. So the kind of bad news is good news element is that the economy is just not strong enough to have people, companies pushing through the prices and people able to demand higher wages. And so that's why the bank will look through it.
I think that's right, and I think we're coming on to talk about the bond market, and there's a vigorous debate. I know you and me sometimes engage on this in social media. Is when you decompose the movement in gilt yields, how much is that is responding to inflation versus political risk, and clearly. Looking at the likely Bank of England response will influence the short end of the gilt curve, and we have seen, as to your point on bad news is good news, when we saw some pretty soft jobs data out of the UK economy last week, illustrating certainly weakness in hiring intentions amongst firms, that started to price out some of the rate increases that had been penciled in, and if you'd interpreted literally the yield curve of the short end for the second half of this year. That makes the point that bad economic news probably limits those second order effects, and therefore the urgency for the Bank of England to have to respond to this kind of energy-led inflation.
I mean, from that point of view, do you think there's likely to be, do you think the Bank of England will just be able to get away with no interest rate hikes this year?
I think so.
What's your central view on it?
It's my central case, and I think that prior to the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting was my view. I haven't heard anything from the MPC, who of course now produce, and I think it's a very welcome development, qualitative comments from each of the 9 members on how they interpret the inflation and the growth picture. And most of the MPC members talked about financial conditions, the curve, doing some of the heavy lifting, because if you take listeners back to the start of the year, the curve was pricing in a couple of rate cuts from the Bank of England, and therefore it's something of a whipsaw to start pricing in rate increases. And of course the real interest rates faced by businesses and households in terms of offered rates from lenders have responded to that. So mortgages have become, the offered interest rates have moved higher, and that is doing some of the policy work that otherwise would be required of bank rate. We also need to acknowledge that 4 years on from the last time we had this energy price shock, the balance sheet of the Bank of England is in divestment mode. It's reducing the amount of held gilts by about £100 billion a year. At the time of the last energy price shock, it was still accruing assets, it was still buying gilts. So again, that transmission through to tighter financial conditions is doing some of the heavy lifting. The MPC would like the market to do its work for it, so it doesn't have to get its hands dirty to be blunt. They're never going to say this, at least that explicitly in the minutes, but that's the subtext, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's fairly obvious because the mortgage market rates have gone up a lot. Although I suppose the point now is that it sounds as if that's likely to settle down for the rest of the year, assuming that the Iran war aspect doesn't get any worse. I mean, have you got any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously you don't have any idea any more than the rest of us whether the Strait of Hormuz is going to open or not. But is there any signs of, I guess, there are elements, I've noticed there's a lot of infrastructure being built that kind of helps to bypass the strait in some ways. A lot of discussion about, well, I don't think we're using quite as much energy. I mean, it's interesting that EasyJet came out and warned the other day that, its summer bookings haven't been brilliant. And that's, on the one hand, you could say that's consumer weakness, but on the other hand, it looks as if a lot of it is simply down to people not really knowing what to do and not wanting to take a flight whenever there's a war on not that far away. Well,
can we take a moment to celebrate something I know you think or you celebrate as I do, the role of prices, the role of markets, of sending signals to destroy demand, to encourage supply. They send really crucial signals, and as I know later in the podcast we're going to talk about politics, but I think politicians get in the way of those important price signals at their peril. And what have events in the Gulf and indeed events in Ukraine done? They have sent messages to agents across the world in both energy markets and energy adjacent markets that they need more resilience, more pluralism in terms of supply of different sources of energy, and they're responding to that price stimulus. You talk about holidaymakers, they're responding to the messages to, of potential constraints of supply capacity in the airlines market of jet fuel by being more cautious in their demand picture, and that is enabling some of those pinch points we were worried about in terms of supply to be somewhat mitigated. I also think give a bit of credit to if you like, not just corporate UK, but the global, corporates, particularly in the travel industry, airline chief execs, who it turns out know a bit more about their industry than some of the substackers that we were all reading about a month ago, who are telling us there will be really acute supply pressures by the end of May if the straits weren't reopened. Well, it turns out that the economic supply chains, the energy supply chains, are a little bit more flexible. Operators are a bit more flexible than we first thought. Yeah. That is a good thing. Those messages, politicians get in the way of at their peril, in my view, and we need to be much more comfortable. Yes, I recognise there is political fallout always with inflation, but the message it sends to the supply side of the economy is really, really important. And I think we perhaps can look at how markets have risk markets have cast off some of the risks in the Gulf, in terms of being quite a celebration of global supply chains.
Yeah. I mean, because it's interesting, because obviously we have heard a lot about price controls recently, particularly with regard to supermarkets, and I think you're right. I mean, this is a kind of object lesson in the value of price as a signalling mechanism, and basically saying to people, look, you need to find a different way to get hold of this, or you need to use less of it. Basically interfere with prices at your peril, which is a nice way to bring us on to politics, I suppose. So Andy Burnham. Yep. Andy Burnham is the mayor of Manchester, and he's the the person who seems at the moment most likely to eventually become the leader of the Labour Party and therefore the next Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And gilt markets appear to have actually given them a bit of a break in the last week or so, although how much of that's down to Andy Burnham and how much of it's actually down to the economy not looking that great is another question. But Tony Blair has stepped in to. It's almost as if the gilt markets have faded away as something to worry about, but now the kind of the spectre of Labour's most successful Prime Minister has kind of risen to give Andy a bit of a nudge in the ribs. Mm-hmm. So what did you think of this? So there's a big letter that came out from the Tony Blair Institute by the man himself, basically making a big sort of wish list of what Britain should do, and explaining why Labour isn't doing it and it needs to start doing some of it. I mean, what was your take on this?
Radical centrism.
Radical centrism.
I mean, there's
a little bit of it's a very political tautology there, really, I think.
Of course.
No, it's not a tautology, it's an oxymoron.
Well,
sorry,
yes.
My figures of speech mixed up. Yeah.
Yes. So what did I make of it? Look, I am no Tony Blair or New Labour fanboy, but he spoke a lot of sense, I felt, in the letter. There are some policy trade-offs that are uncomfortable for what has been called the soft left of the Labour Party, that he shines a light on, or maybe holds a mirror up at, on immigration, on net zero, on the world order, on the relationship with Europe. It's a kind of it's quite an essay, isn't it, of the big, both structural challenges facing the middle powers, and he references Mark Carney in his sort of speech or call to arms in Davos earlier in the year, but also some of the shorter term political challenges and perhaps some of the failings of the prospective Labour leadership candidates and the incumbents of not having the policy debates, which I think you and I share this frustration ahead of the 2024 general election, and trying to make policy or have the debate with the public about some of the difficult decisions on technology, the cost of ageing, on immigration, on welfare spending in Parliament, in government, without a manifesto to backstop that, with which to use to whip your own parties, not literally but at least metaphorically, is a real difficult challenge. And to me, comes back to the challenge Andy Burnham will have if he takes that path you lay out, which is he wins the Makerfield by-election, he wins the Labour leadership and he becomes Prime Minister. On one side he'll be boxed in by the bond market, and the other side will be boxed in by his own political brethren. and therefore the room for manoeuvre is quite limited. And by the way, I think it is that limited room for manoeuvre that bond markets have responded quite favourably to, because what has been revealed over the last couple of weeks is how many limits there are politically and financially on his ability to be particularly radical, be it a radical centrist or a radical leftist or a radical Mancunian or whatever descriptor we want to give it. And to some extent, markets are saying, well, the status quo is not, it's not great, but it's not a deterioration from here.
But the thing, I wanted to run through some of the things that Blair said, because I thought it was quite interesting, because, well, I mean, so we mentioned immigration, and he says, okay, first of all, he said that's something very punchy, which was, he said we need to do whatever it takes to stop illegal immigration. And specifically mentions the small boats.
Yep.
So that's the first thing. He says we need skilled immigration, but we need to stop the illegal stuff. He says that on energy, we should focus on getting cheap energy rather than clean energy. So stop going down the net zero route quite as vigorously and drill for more North Sea oil and gas. That's in there as well. What was the other thing that we were mentioning a minute ago? He talks about how the new world order is actually not a new world order. It's just the Americans finally being a bit more blunt about the fact that Europe and the UK haven't been pulling their weight in terms of, I mean, actually the UK's probably not actually as bad in terms of defence, but saying, look, we need you guys to contribute more because the world's getting a more dangerous place. And what strikes me is that he isn't saying anything that I think most people outside of the actual Labour Party, and possibly those to the left of the Labour Party, would consider to be controversial. I was seeing someone on Twitter this morning said, how do you get these messages across in a populist world where they're going to be unpopular? And I was thinking, wait a minute, Nigel Farage could have said half of this stuff. And
most of it,
basically, he's already yep, we want to ditch net zero, we want to get immigration under control, and no, we don't think the Americans have lost their marbles, they've just got kind of frustrated with us. So I just it strikes me as very odd that Tony Blair is essentially able to say all of these things and they just come across as being common sense. In the face of I guess whereas if the Conservatives or Reform had said it, there would be a sense of, oh my goodness, you can't say this, or what, are you climate deniers, are you racist for wanting to stop kind of illegal immigration, that sort of response. And I'm just wondering, I mean, do you think any of this is actually going to help Labour to talk about this stuff in a way that might change the policy? Say, let's take energy, act a bit more sensibly on that front, maybe at least let some of the licenses continue in the North Sea.
Depressingly, I feel it will not change the preferences revealed and targeted from the current cohort of Labour MPs, who I have thought really since very shortly after the general election that they cut their teeth in think tanks and special advisors, most of them in a non-private sector background, during a period where those luxury beliefs on net zero, on immigration, on the role of the United States, zero interest rates, were all conditioning assumptions that could allow those luxury beliefs to come with relatively little cost. But they've all changed. All of that list has changed. And what I struggle to see is how, having set your stall out, and for different MPs, they've sent their stall outs in different ways, because it's actually quite a broad church, the Labour Party.
Well, that's part of the problem for that, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Having set your stall out on what you really care about, reversing out of that and saying the facts have changed, the financial facts have changed, the geopolitical context has changed, population flow has changed, the war in Iran has changed these calculations. It becomes very, very difficult for the individuals. It comes down to those people to reverse course. Keynes said, of course, famously, when the facts change, I change my view. Keynes is not someone whose view is, at least not in terms of that quote, something that this cohort of Labour MPs show a huge affinity to.
He was an unusual guy, Keynes. I think we can definitely give him that. I mean, look, I guess then, though, so coming back to gilts, because the thing that strikes me is that, okay, it's one thing, the gilts market might be thinking, okay, the status quo is all right, so if we get kind of Burnham in, he's going to toe the line, he's not going to, completely go off and win. But that then means he's basically going to face exactly the same problem that Starmer's facing just now. He might be a more personable individual, he might be slightly better at talking to, he might be better at the comms thing, as they keep talking about. But he's still going to face the problem whereby, regardless of, he might have taken the message of the gilt market on board, but I don't think all of the kind of further left MPs will have. He's still going to be stuck with things like being unable to reform welfare, yet another thing that Tony Blair said, we need to cut welfare costs. So that kind of leaves us rumbling along.
It does.
For the next conceivably 3 years. I mean, do you think that happens, or do you think we get a general election before then? Or
I mean, it feels like squeezing the balloon, doesn't it? Because if you decide that your room to manoeuvre without a fresh mandate is very limited, and I think if you want to do anything on some of the proposals in terms of nationalisation, on terms of property taxation, wealth taxation that have been proposed by Andy Burnham, it feels very difficult to do that without a fresh political mandate. But then you come in to lead your party and you announce early on that you're going to voluntarily trigger an event that will probably make, on current polling, 3/4 of your colleagues unemployed. Not a direct route, as far as I can establish, to popularity, internal popularity. So, unfortunately, that conclusion, therefore, is that the mandate bequeathed to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in 2024 will be the one that they will run with all the way through to 2029, and therefore any radicalism from Andy Burnham will immediately face the challenge of legitimacy. Bringing it back to the bond market, which you opened the question with, is I think we also need to look at the other scenario where we've talked a lot about Andy Burnham, but let's say he loses the Makerfield by-election.
Yeah, which is possible.
Which at the moment doesn't look, I mean, it currently looks like the right of centre vote is being split between Reform and Restore, and that's allowing Andy Burnham a bit more gap to win that. But if he doesn't, I think the market would be worried about another candidate from they self-style themselves as the soft left, but probably more left than Andy Burnham, and some character like either Angela Rayner or Ed Miliband, who the bond market would respond more negatively to. So I think some of that compression of yields, the spread between the 10-year gilt and the 10-year treasury, is a result of some more favourable polling for Andy Burnham that actually means that some of those more left-wing candidates from the Labour Party won't have to throw their hat into the ring, which I think they would inevitably have to do if Andy Burnham didn't have a seat in Parliament.
So, I mean, on that, I mean, what would a crisis actually look like? Because assume, let's say something happens, let's say Burnham loses, and let's say that then Angela Rayner or Ed Miliband decide that that's their opportunity, and rather than, say, coming to power and saying, OK, we'll stick with Rachel Reeves as Chancellor just to keep you folk happy, they stick someone to the left of them in. I mean, at what point would you say, I mean, the words Liz Truss moment are vastly overused, and I always go back to how it was about LDI, but at what point do you say, actually, this is where a kind of doom loop could start? We're talking 6% in the 10-year, or what are we thinking about?
Well, I thought the 5.5% on the 10-year is a pain threshold for both the public finances and actually potentially for the Bank of England to have to step in, as they did actually after the LDI crisis of 2022. But and these may be, maybe we'll pull the tapes in 6 months' time if this if this plays out different to what I anticipate, which is if this scenario were to play out, I think bond markets are the most rational of the financial assets that we look at, and they would just somewhat impartially just apply a higher inflation premium for the UK economy, to own sterling assets. And you can see that most obviously in gilts, I think, but you would also see it in UK focused equities, domestic equities as well, is that the policies that those two have been associated with, net zero in the case of Ed Miliband, the Renters Reform Act and the Employee Rights Act from Angela Rayner, are all three of them seen as inflationary. Yeah. Inflationary in energy markets, inflationary in jobs markets, inflationary in land and property markets in terms of rents. That is not a good position to sort of set out your stall for a broader economic agenda. And are the markets, as the gilt market, going to wait for those individuals to set out their broader economic stall, or just say, well, there's the signal. The signal is that will illustrate with a kind of a higher inflation premium in the UK economy, and therefore we just price things accordingly, which is just an incremental increase on gilt yields, nominal gilt yields.
Yeah, and it's presumably at that point that's when everyone starts panicking about their mortgage, and maybe that's what brings the next government into line. And
to your point on, there's two responses. There's the private sector in terms of a slowdown in demand because of tighter credit conditions, but then there's also the impact the next time the OBR forecast in those widely assumed to be November and the November budget, if you plug in those kind of yields, some of that 23 billion pounds worth of headroom that the Chancellor left herself back in the spring will have largely evaporated, and therefore we're back in that cycle which I'd rather hope, I think we both hope, had been left behind, with that speculation day to day, week to week, that taxes are going to have to go up or spending's going to have to be cut, which credit to Rachel Reeves, and she doesn't get much, but having rebuilt in the last two fiscal events the headroom, we have seen a diminution of that speculative cycle. If we get that back, that's not great news for the economic momentum of the UK economy.
Yeah. Well, look, before we wrap up, is there one policy that Andy Burnham, assuming he is the next Prime Minister, could bring in that would make you feel a little bit more upbeat about prospects for the economy, UK economy?
Yes, and he has spoken about this, albeit he hasn't defined the exact parameters of it. And this is a land value tax or a proportional property tax. I look at the £64 billion that the Exchequer raises off a combination of stamp duty, land tax and council tax, and you think of them as two very poorly designed taxes. Yep. Stamp duty is a friction, and you and I were desperate to talk about stamp duty on shares, but let's talk about stamp duty on residential property. It's a friction, a £14 billion a year friction, and then a £50 billion a year very regressive tax, which is council tax, which has been unreformed in the UK since the early 1990s. Yep. And if you swept those away and replaced it with a proportional property tax, you incentivise right sizing of the property stock, you incentivise moving, and it's a broadly progressive move. I don't pretend it is easy. I don't pretend there aren't losers associated with it in terms of distributional losers. But as a pro-growth initiative, because effectively you are engineering new supply, particularly by right sizing, and you're generating VAT receipts from higher number of transactions, home improvements, etc. That feels to me a very, very pro-growth policy. And the question really for Andy Burnham is whether, without a fresh manifesto and mandate, whether he can push through something that politicians have ducked for 35 years.
I mean, that's a fascinating one. And I can see, well, it touches on that thing that's so important to kind of UK voters, isn't it? The kind of price of houses and the house is a castle, and it's always the kind of pensioner living in somewhere in Mayfair who is cash poor and asset kind of vastly wealthy who then gets hit. Mm-hmm. But I suppose if any shade of government can push through that sort of issue, then it's quite possibly a Labour one. So no, that's an interesting one.
But I think if you look at thematically what is wrong with the UK economy, it has been the sclerosis of our supply side. And property and land, most obviously, has been underdeveloped, underutilized. It has become a store of value rather than an asset to promote geographical mobility, labour mobility, aspiration. And therefore, and that part of that legacy is a result of how it has been taxed, really poorly taxed. And so at some point, and I hope it's not in crisis, I hope it is proactively, you address that and address one part of the three legs of the stool with energy and the capital markets being the other two, where the supply side has been neglected for decades. A growth story, and this is maybe we end with the sort of something else Blair said in his letter, is if growth is your primary mission, you don't add more frictions to generating growth, which is basically the criticism of the last 2 years of the Labour government, having come in promising growth was their primary mission. They've introduced a lot of policies that have made growth in the private sector even harder to achieve.
Excellent. Well, so fingers crossed for a land value tax then. but if you're listening, Mr. Burnham, you have to replace the existing taxes, not add an extra one on top.
100%.
Thanks very much, Simon, for being on the show.
It was a huge pleasure. Thanks, John.